Hello ladies and gentlemen. Today in War Thunder we're going to be talking about the B1 Ter. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about its historical side and then go into how it will probably perform in game. Now understand the B1 Ter isn't out yet, but the historical side of it is so interesting to me. I thought I would make a video talking about its history, especially the line of tanks where it comes from, and pretty much how it was birthed and why it was around in the first place. There are many different French tanks which are like this, such as the S-35, in terms of how their stories of coming about are interesting. So I might do some other videos about stuff like that as well. But do understand that this is the B1 Ter, or the Char B1 Ter if you want. But I'm personally going to be calling it the Bitter, just because it is easier to say. But just understand that's wrong, and you should say the B1 Ter if you're in a polite company, we'll say. But anyway, let's start from the grassroots of where this machine came from. So the Char de Bataille, or Bataille, was a concept created by Colonel Estienne, who was supposedly in France the father of tanks. He pretty much made a bunch of memoirs, or wrote many memoirs down after World War I in 1919, and most of it was tactical reports, it was ideas for mechanized warfare. It was pretty much the blueprint for a lot of French thought going into the 1920s and 1930s when it came to tank design. So he had these two core concepts to a lot of his beliefs. So you had the Char de Bataille and the Char de Rupture. Now the Char de Bataille is a battle tank, which would be a heavy tank, and then you also had a breakthrough tank, which would be a dual-purpose infantry support and anti-tank machine. Now the Char B1 falls under the battle tank area of a heavy tank. It wasn't actually seen as an infantry support and anti-tank. Stuff like the FMCF1 was seen much more in that role. But anyway, moving on. So because of the duality of this belief, where you would have an anti-tank or an infantry support or a battle tank in this area, this meant that many prototypes were made of many different verifications or many different specializations. In 1921, the project was studied by the commission led by General Edmund Buat, and the first specification was for a low-cost self-propelled artillery, so 25mm of armor and some machine guns in the turrets, and then a maximum weight was 30 tons. So not a very large machine, but something that could definitely support the infantry, and if there was something very, let's say lightly armored, then this artillery piece should be able to do the job. But then, as tank design got more interesting and tank design moved on and evolved in the world, the project itself evolved, and it was created a machine gun turret, which would be equipped with an anti-tank 47mm gun, and then you'd have the main 75mm howitzer in a low-hull sponson. And then, once you had this doctrine of what they actually wanted, companies started getting involved, creating several projects, or at least blueprints for specific tanks, and that's pretty good. So industrial rivalry was sparked again, which from the past had delayed many projects, which included the FCM 2C. Now if you don't know what the FCM 2C is, it is definitely an interesting machine, we'll say that. It was one of those absolutely homunculus machines which looks like you could live in it as a house. And I would definitely say go and have a look at it. It weighed 69 tons loaded, and it had some armor which was kind of insane on it for the time. Imagine like a better A1E1 Independence. That's how I would say it was. But anyway, so after the industrial rivalry and issues cropping up between the companies, instead of you know, instead of the rivalry being a good thing, where, you know, you push each company to the limit and they become, they create amazing things, what happened is they kind of just, you know, just got annoyed at each other, meaning that everything was delayed. So, after that, seeing what was happening, STN was poised to create a formal agreement which would be submitted to all of the industrialists. They could share all their plans, and then if they did share all their plans, then there would be a promise of no less than 1,000 orders. So that's pretty much how that worked, a bit of tit for tat there to try and get some more clarification on what was going on, but also promise some nice orders. But then, after the plans came in, what happened was the army obviously had to choose which project they wanted to back. A lot of companies threw in their ideas, but the main 4 companies involved were Renault, Schneider, FAMH, and FCM. So the Renault and Schneider made the SRA and SRB, the FAMH made the Saint-Chamond, the FCM Forge et Chantier de la Méditerranée, there you go, with the FCM 21. So the 4 projects, one from each company, they were submitted to the Commission on the 13th of May 1924 at Atelier des Roues, and the 20-kilometer test course proved too much for all of the projects, which is very sad, but unfortunately a reality when you're trying to make a heavy tank that was designed for infantry support and busting through stuff eventually. And because they were a bit hasty on all of the tank designs moving forward, unfortunately this meant that they had to pretty much go back to the drawing board, make sure that they could actually survive a 20-mile test course. The Commission, over the supervision of STN, chose the SRB as a base, though, which, you know, is kind of interesting at the time. So the SRB, which was made by Schneider and Renault as a joint project, it weighed 18.5 tons. It was 6 meters long, and it had modified FT tracks with an anti-tank 47mm gun. It also had the Renault 6-cylinder 180 horsepower engine. It had hydraulic nader transmission from the Shays company, combined with a Fuhr, clutch, and Schneider gearbox, which all of this together could create 18.5 kilometers of speed. And then a 370 liter fuel tank, giving it around about 370 kilometers autonomy. So you're talking about 1 liter per kilometer, which is not great, but then again, this is a machine which nearly weighs 20 tons, and also not as efficient as machines nowadays. But as you can see, this is a conglomeration project where the other companies were pretty much working by themselves. So the Schneider and Renault project was obviously a bit more appealing to the testers because of this, because they had much more going on for them and could also pull resources from many other areas. So from that initial prototype, it received many modifications. One of the first modifications was a hull-mounted 75mm howitzer. Some new Holt-type tracks, which is kind of the iconic tracks that you see on the Char B1 Bis in pictures, you know, where it pretty much has like, I don't know how to describe them apart from Warhammer tracks, I don't know why. It also had the FAMH suspension, track tension wheel, and a small gangway to access the engine, with also 40mm of armor. So as you can see, they're taking the best parts of each of the designs and putting them together. So this is kind of interesting because if you look at a lot more European countries or even America, what generally happened was you would go with one company's design and then that was pretty much it. There was no like leeway. But in French tank design, it was much more of a group effort, which I think is kind of interesting. So this is going into the design of the B1 itself. So the design process for this modified SRB, it led to the 1926 Traktor 30, and then the plans were made by Schneider's chief engineer. They were then revised by the STCC, which was the Section Technique de Char de Combat, and a mock-up was built by Renault, and 3 prototypes were to be built by the companies involved, all working together, as I said before. And then some modifications were made by the new 1926 Direction de l'Infanterie, and changing it to a primary infantry support tank. So instead of a ball buster or a anti-tank tank, it was much more designed to support the infantry as they move forward instead of killing other tanks. So modifications of the design included no AT weapon, a lower speed, 20 tons max, and radio for coordination. So you can see from all of those movements that it's much more geared towards infantry. Lower speed, meaning that the infantry can keep up with it. 22 tons, probably giving it more armor while it's moving slowly. No AT weapon, meaning that it can't kill any enemy tanks. So yeah, as simple as that. So then the 3 prototypes of the B series, the 101, 102, and 103, they were ready by 1929-30, which is kind of impressive if you think about it, because of how big they are and the amount of manpower which would have had to go into these prototypes. They differed by their engine, clutch, transmission, and served both for tactical and technological experiments. So at the Champ de Chalon, forming the Détachement d'Expérimentation units in 1931. They were extensively used in maneuvers until 1934, and each time with some modifications by the Atelier des Roues near Paris, to meet new requirements and the Army specifications. In the end, the B1 received its final turret with the low-velocity 47mm and coaxial rival machine gun. So after all of these tests of just having the 75mm, they once again decided to add the 47mm turret back onto it, making it at least have some kind of anti-tank capability. And the 47mm was nothing to laugh at in 1934, but of course by the time war came about, or I suppose 1940 would be a bit better, it wasn't the best, but it was still serviceable. So, like the 1924 prototypes, what it had was a very large track. This was actually inspired by famous British models. You may remember Little Willie, or stuff like that in World War I, how large their tracks were. Well, yeah, it was pretty much based on models that they could see through at least World War I and slightly after, with the British armour. The armour also protected the suspension, and the hull was riveted, which was very common at the time, and luckily, while World War II went along, riveting became a thing of the past. It was definitely an issue for its armour. The Renault inline 6-cylinder 16.5-litre petrol engine was chosen, and then that provided 9.7 brake horsepower per tonne, and the power was transmitted by a double differential steering system, 5 forward, 1 reverse gear, and the suspension was in the form of bogies, with a mixture of vertical coil and leaf springs. Both early and final turret designs, the APX-1, were one-man only, which, as I talked about in the video yesterday, was a real issue, because it basically meant that the commander had to spot tanks, had to shoot tanks, had to load the gun, and all of this stuff. Now, he didn't have to use the radio, because there was a radio man in the hull, but still, it was a hell of a lot of work for one man to do, which was very unfortunate. At the same time, if you want to see how they actually fix tracks or change tracks, go and watch the Chieftain World of Tank video on the Char B1 Bis, and you'll see how much of a pain it would have been to try and change these tracks. But after the prototype phase and the design phase, of course you go into the production phase. So production of the machine started in 1935. Renault built 182 Char Bis. AMX, a Schneider subsidiary at the time, made 47, FCM 72, and FAMH made 70. So as you can see, this isn't just one company, this is everybody blasting at it, which is great. So at 1.5 million francs a piece, it was the most expensive tank ever built en masse. At least, well, I don't know if that's very... I mean, maybe with inflation and stuff, like, I don't know what the value of the franc is right now, but I feel like some of the modern tanks may be a little bit more expensive than it. But anyway, because it was so expensive to create, the original order of 1,000 was reduced to 400, and this further increased the tension between the two doctrinal schools, which I mentioned at the start, which had to influence them. One professing the use of a few heavily armoured battle tanks, while the other advocated to use a swarm of light tanks. So almost 10 light Renault tanks could be built for the price of a single B1. Despite all problems, monthly production reached 41 by May 1940, and when it ceased in June 25th, 369 had left the factory floor. So they did a bit better than some of the French aircraft, but still, you know, they didn't get half of the 1,000 orders, but they nearly got, 400, which was the secondary order. A hell of a lot better than the French aircraft, but that was, really about it. Not as good as some of the other nations, let's say. As the few and even more expensive and now largely obsolete FC-M2Cs was kept out of real operations, the B1 became the main French char de rupture, so that is the breakthrough tank for specialized units, as I talked about before. So the operational capabilities were limited by its high consumption, which meant that its range was limited and pretty much condemned it to be used in strategic reserves, which is very sad. And by high consumption, it means it chugged through fuel like an MF, basically. In fact, they formed the Division Cuirassé de Reserve, and this had limited strategic flexibility, and it was intended for the second phase of the assault, so it would be the backup to come in, and if the battering ram hadn't done the job, bring in the bigger battering ram. The B1 did have some shortcomings though, which had to be sorted out. This is why we have more variants than just the B1. It had an obvious lack of anti-tank firepower. The low velocity L276 SA-34 47mm, it only had APHE rounds, which may be useful in game, but not as useful in real life, because they could only penetrate 25mm of armor. Remember, this is a low velocity 47, it's not going to be breaking any world speed records here. And then the 75, which is the SA-35 ABS L17.1 howitzer, could fire HE and APHE rounds, which were only suitable against fortifications. Once again, the APHE might be useful against tanks in game, but not so useful against them in real life. It also had a port traverse of only 1 degree on the 75mm, which obviously isn't very good, so you'd have to turn the whole tank just to turn the 75mm. Definitely not great. And the aiming was given to the driver's abilities with the Nader hydraulic precision transmission. So as I said before, you had to turn the whole tank to shoot, which, let's say you're slightly off, well, it's annoying as hell. Also, it was served by the radio man and the commander, who was given the task of aiming and firing the turret 47mm, basically the turret 47mm. Communication was assumed by an ER-53 radio telegraphy set, which worked with Morse code only, so no audio, just Morse code you're working with right now. Can you imagine trying to tap Morse code while you're on the move? In a tank which, yes, has pretty decent suspension, but still going to vibrate a lot. That must be a pain in the arse. There was a small corridor right on the rear which gave access to the ammunition reserve, which was next to the engine. And then there was a main access door, which was on the right side, and the suspension system was kind of complicated, made of 3 main bogies sprung by vertical coil springs, each supporting 2 others, with a pair of rolled wheels. And then, so because of the technical and the cost of the machine, the production of the B1 was incredibly slow. So only 34 machines were delivered until July 1937. By then, there was a serious consideration given to an upgrade, which led to the B1 Bis. So they've already made 300 and they'd only made 34 machines by July 1937. There was already all of these issues with it. So then they thought, you know what, why not upgrade it? Maybe it'll get more people interested. Maybe it'll make it easier to produce and stuff like that. So the B1 Bis came along. So the B1 Bis was a modernization of the type, obviously the tank that we had before. It had an emphasis on the anti-tank capability and also protection of the tank. So the armor was uprated to 60mm, and a new APX-4 turret with a longer barrel SA-35 47mm gun was mounted. And then to cope with the added weight, which was now 31 tons, so quite larger than the original, a new engine was fitted, a V12 Renault capable of 307 brake horsepower. A hell of a lot better than 9 brake horsepower, something that they had before. I'm sorry for clearing my throat a lot. It is how it is. Cold season is here. So 35 of the first series were retrofitted with the new engine, and autonomy was limited to only 180 kilometers. So its range was terrible, but at least it had a really good brake horsepower and could actually go faster than a snail's pace. There had also been some attempts to tow an extra 800-litre fuel tank to pretty much boost its range, but they were never realized, probably because in an actual event of a war, it wouldn't be very practical. At cruise speed, though, reserves were exhausted in just 6 hours, and a larger left air intake was also fitted to cool the engine. Ammunition storage was improved between the beginning and the end of the production from 62 to 72 47mm rounds, but still no AP shells, so you're stuck with the APHE. Production started in April 1937 and stopped in June 1940. By then, 377 had been delivered out of an order of 1144, but only 129 were actually ready in September 1939, which is definitely an issue when you want it. Obviously, at the time the Battle of France was going on, you definitely needed these tanks to be on your side. So in exercises, the complex and advanced hydrostatic steering, the NADA system, proved difficult to use and costly. It was betrayed by other technical elements like a porous bronze housing and feeble seals, causing significant losses of castor oil, which is, if you know anything about lubrication, you pretty much need it. The TSF was not practical, as the tanks needed to be at rest to communicate. So, as I said before, just go into a car which will have better suspension than this thing. It will have much more comfy ride. Try and do Morse code in just a car, and you'll see what I mean. There was no tactical coordination possible on the move, and the costly turret was slower to produce than the hulls, and 3 B1 Bises were ultimately put in service without a turret as gun carriages, so pretty much just with the 75mm, and that was it, which is kind of interesting. I feel like you could have that in game. It'd be very similar to that Churchill variant. By very similar, I mean absolutely useless, but still kind of cool. So the B1 Ter was a late attempt to radically improve the design. Now we're finally on to the B1 Ter after talking about the the lead up to it. So the B1 Ter was a way to, as I said, radically improve the design. The main features of the machine were a new 75mm armor welded with slopes on the hull, so a hell of a lot more armor, a new 350 brake horsepower engine to deal with this added weight of 36.6 tons, and some simplifications in the design for mass production in 1940. So they omitted the Nader transmission, they rearranged interior, which allowed a fifth crew member to be carried as a mechanic, and the main howitzer received better traverse, so it had 5 degrees higher. It didn't get any, well, traverse, sorry, so 5 degrees instead of 1 degree. Not great, but at least a little bit better. Only 2 prototypes were actually ready by June 1940, and production actually never started. So that's, I mean, they tried, but it just didn't get there in time. The B1 also had some additional flaws on top of all of this, which never helped its performance. So the high consumption issue, which was pretty much caused by the aiming of the main howitzer, having to turn the whole machine to be able to fire the 75mm, was never an easy job. The absence of an efficient compass orientation and no internal communication system, meaning that if the commander wanted to shoot, he had to scream at the driver to stop if he felt like he didn't want to stop because he was trying to aim his 75, then you can see how it can get incredibly crazy incredibly quickly. The one-man APX-1 turret was also cramped, its ergonomics were poor, and the feebly armoured cupola had inadequate means of vision, so definitely a weak point. The barrel pointing device was also quickly deregulated, meaning it was useless. There were also many other issues which were never solved because of the delays of the machines, but the most serious was pretty much the tactical management of them, which isn't down to the tank's faults, that's down to the people trying to work out what they should do with them. Very similar to how some of the British doctrines just never really fit actual combat. We'll get into that in another time. So the B1s were wasted at an individual defensive spot. Many were just simply outmaneuvered, they just went around them. And despite all of this, the B1s were still tank-to-tank formidable machines, which proved very effective in single actions. So they were still useful, even though they had these whole host of issues. They just... First of all, there wasn't enough of them. Second of all, they had too many technical issues. But they were still a fearsome opponent on the battlefield, which is generally why Germany used quite a lot of them moving forward. But on top of all of this, I just want to point out a very interesting machine. Now this is a German-captured B1 Bis, but they put a 105 on it. And I just want to say, yes, I understand this existed. Yes, I know there's 16 of them built. No, I don't want any of them in the game. This was a 10.5cm LEFH-183 SF auf Geschutzwagen B2F. Now please, don't put this in the game, because I feel like it can be abused to all hell. Just because I know how these heavy tanks with large guns go. Hello KV, how are you doing? But anyway, let's get back to the Bitter. So when we talk about the Bitter, it is going to be the best version of the Char B1 that we're going to have in game. We're probably going to have the B1 original, the B1 Bis, and the B1 Ter. I'll be incredibly surprised if we see the prototype version of it, but we're definitely going to see those 3 vehicles, and at least we're going to see a B1 Bis and a B1 Ter. We already know that a B1 Bis exists as a user-created machine, and we know a Ter exists because, well, that's what we're talking about right now, and it's available in a pack for you to get. So what you're getting out of it is quite a lot of armor. You've got to remember this is rank 2, it'll probably be around 3, so the only thing you have to worry about is the long-barreled 75 that the Germans have. But with a ton of armor on the front of it, you should be able to angle it efficiently so you don't die. The 75 in itself, yes, it does have 5 degrees of traverse. Does that mean that is it going to be good? I don't think so. It does have APHE though, so against lighter targets, I believe it should be quite good. The 47 in itself, yes, it is upgraded over the first version of the gun, which was really low velocity and could only penetrate about 25 millimeters, but it's still not going to penetrate that much, and it's going to come up against, if it is around that 3, let's say you get matched up against the Americans, you're not going to be able to spend a Sherman with it. If you get matched up against the British, Churchill's laugh at you. The Matilda might not, if you can hit that weak spot. If you get matched up against the Germans, you might be able to penetrate the Germans, especially with the flat parts on stuff like the Panzer IV F2s. The Japanese you'll be able to pen. The Russians are going to chuckle all the way to the bank. So that is something you've got to realize. Now, on top of all of this, with the B1 Ter, you do have an upgraded engine. So at least you have a little bit of acceleration behind you, a little bit of speed, meaning that on maps which have which are small town maps, so like Poland and Eastern Europe, you will be able to get to decent places before the match ends. You will be able to get to nice firing positions, you will be able to move forward and support the team. What you might not be able to do is turn when somebody is to your right or left. And this all depends on the 47. So if the 47 is good enough to kill the majority of targets that you find at this tier, then what you're going to find is the majority of B1 Ters just won't turn and they'll just use the 47. But if they are forced to turn, then these machines are going to be half as good as they could have been. So it all really depends on how good that 47mm is with its APHE rounds. Of course, as it says, and as I said in this video, there was no AP rounds, there was no solid shot. And I know a lot of people call foul of the solid shot in this game, but if you have a smaller gun and you're at a low BR, solid shot is a pretty good deal. Because it means you can reliably penetrate whatever you're shooting at, and you can do damage, so you don't have to worry about, not penning. And a good example of this is a machine like the naval gunned Japanese premium, compared to something like a Cromwell or a Crusader. But overall, it really depends how useful the 47 is. The 75 I think is going to be pretty useless, but you're going to see some donk shots every once in a while. If it is around 3, I think it's going to get pretty much massacred by the really good T-34s and Panzer IV F2s, but if it's a bit lower, I feel like it has a chance. Like T-28 level, I think it would be really fun, because you'd bounce quite a lot, your armor would actually be useful, and the 47 would be useful too. We'll have to see moving forward where it gets put in the tech tree. Once it does come up on the dev server, I will have a chat about it. But I hope you enjoyed this video looking at the historical part of the B1 Ter and the B1 series in general. And if you want any more information, I'll put some links in the description for you. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.